Forgotten NHL Stars, Montreal Canadiens edition. The Montreal Canadiens are an NHL franchise with legends who have been mythicized and are larger than life, from Maurice Richard to John Beliveau to Guy Lafleur to Patrick Roy and Larry Robinson. Montreal might be the richest franchise in hockey, but it also has the deepest pool of players in history quietly erased and overlooked due to the team's legends. This list includes Vincent Damphousse, Chelios, Naslund, Stephane Richer, and many more. Here are some of the forgotten stars of the Montreal Canadiens in their franchise's history. Vincent Damphousse is one of those rare players whose Montreal tenure was both excellent and underappreciated, largely because he played in the most turbulent decade in modern Canadiens history. He played for the Canadiens from 1992 to 1999. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't political, and he wasn't a headline machine. He was simply elite. Damphousse was the Canadiens' best all-around forward of the 90s. He was a stabilizer on teams that desperately needed one. He could play center or wing and locked heavy minutes. Damphousse was a top-line driver on the last Canadiens team to win the Cup. He scored 97 points in the regular season and 23 points in the playoffs. Since 1993, only one Montreal player has even approached that level of production. Roy gets mythicized, but Damphousse was the offensive engine of the team. Damphousse captained the Canadiens from 1996 to 1999 during one of the most difficult periods in franchise history and was a steady presence in the storm. This period saw the Forum close, the Molson Center transition, post-Roy fallout, and early signs of organizational decline. His style wasn't loud, he wasn't a highlight machine like Lafleur, nor was he a Koivu-like emotional leader. He was simply consistently elite, and that's the type of player history forgets. His legacy is muted not because he lacked greatness, but because he lacked spectacle. He is, in every sense, a forgotten Montreal Canadiens star, and is one of the most important players in the franchise's post-dynasty identity. Chelios is one of the greatest defensemen in NHL history, but the Montreal portion of his career is strangely under-discussed, overshadowed by the dynasty that preceded him and the chaos that followed. Yet in the mid-80s, he was Montreal's best defenseman, their emotional heartbeat, and the future of the blue line. At just 24, Chelios was already playing massive minutes. He wasn't just along for the ride, he was a core piece of that 1986 Cup run. He brought physicality, edge, elite skating, shutdown ability, and big moment swagger. He was the emotional counterweight to Roy's brilliance. Chelios won the Norris Trophy in 1989 as a Montreal Canadien. That season, he put up 73 points while averaging 28 minutes of night, while being dominant on both ends. The Chelios for Denis Savard trade is one of the most infamous trades in Habs history. It instantly reframed him as a Blackhawk legend, not a Habs one. Chelios' Montreal tenure is a story of a franchise that had a generational defenseman on its hands, a Norris winner, a Cup champion, and a foundational piece, and let him go just as he was entering his prime. He was the bridge between the Robinson era and the modern NHL, the emotional engine of the late 80s Canadiens, and the last true elite homegrown number one defenseman the team had produced. He is the quintessential forgotten Canadian star, a legend whose Montreal chapter is overshadowed by the legend he became elsewhere. Mats Naslund wasn't just good, he was the Montreal Canadiens' best forward of the 1980s. He was the bridge between the Lafleur era and the modern NHL, and the last Hab to hit 100 points. However, his legacy is a masterclass in how a player can be great but not mythicized. Mats Naslund is the last Montreal Canadien to score 100 points in the 1985-86 season. That stat alone should make him a franchise legend. He is the final member of the Canadiens' true superstar scorer lineage and was the core piece of the 1986 Stanley Cup. While Roy stole the spotlight, Naslund was the offensive engine of the team. He led the team in scoring, played in every situation, and was the most reliable forward on the team. He was the steady heartbeat of that cup. Run. Naslund brought a style Montreal hadn't seen before. Elite edge work, quick hands, creative passing, underrated shot, and had a cerebral, almost European-style approach to offense. At 5'7", Naslund was one of the smallest stars in the league, but he was not a novelty act. He was a legitimate superstar. He paved the ways for players like Theo Fleury, Marty St. Louis, Brian Giunta, and Cole Caulfield after him. He was the first great Swedish player in Habs history. He opened the doors for the franchise's Scandinavian pipeline. His success changed how Montreal scouted and evaluated European talent. His legacy is muted not because he lacked greatness, but because he lacked spectacle, arriving in a transitional era between Lafleur and the modern era, and before the franchise could mythologize him. He is the quintessential forgotten Canadian star who was elite, essential, and under-celebrated. Stephane Richer is one of the most naturally gifted scorers the Canadiens have ever produced, and yet he's rarely mentioned alongside the likes of Lafleur. His story is a perfect example of how one can be great but not mythologized. Stephane Richer is the only 50-goal scorer the Habs have produced after Guy Lafleur. This alone should make him a franchise legend. In fact, he scored 50 or more goals twice in 1987-88 and 1989-90. Richer had a heavy and accurate release combined with breakaway speed and a power forward frame. He was a nightmare matchup in the late 80s and had the ability to score from anywhere. Richer was a key offensive driver of the 1986 Stanley Cup team. At just 20 years old, Richer was already a top 6 contributor on a cup-winning team. He played in the lost era during the late 80s, early 90s, when the Canadiens weren't a dynasty, weren't a disaster, just a transitional team. Players from this era get swallowed by history. Montreal loves flashy artists like Lafleur, emotional leaders like Koivu, defensive titans like Robinson, and mythical goalies like Watt or Dryden. Richer was none of these. He was a pure scorer, and Montreal has always been weirdly uncomfortable with pure scorers. His personality didn't match the market. Richer was quiet, introverted, and struggled with pressure and expectations. Montreal wanted a showman. He wanted to play hockey. That mismatch shaped his legacy. Stephane Richer is the last great homegrown sniper in Habs history, a player with rare physical tools, elite finishing ability, and the kind of raw scoring talent the franchise hasn't seen since. However, he arrived in a transitional era, carried the weight of a city that wanted another Lafleur, and never fit the emotional or stylistic mold Montreal demands of its stars. Other forgotten stars of the Montreal Canadiens include Shayne Corson, Russ Courtnall, Petr Svoboda, and Jeff Hackett. These 4 players were legitimately excellent, but swallowed by timing, narrative, and era. Shayne Corson is the kind of player Montreal usually mythicized. He was physical, emotional, matchup-driven, and playoff-wired, but he played in the wrong era for his style to become legend. Corson was an elite matchup forward, captain material, and played heavy minutes. He was one of the few emotional anchors of the late 80s, early 90s turbulence. Shayne Corson was not a flashy scorer, not a mythic goalie, and not a dynasty-era name. Corson is the prototype of the forgotten warrior, essential but not celebrated. Russ Courtnall was one of the fastest players of his era, a pure transition weapon before the league understood how valuable that was. Courtnall is a 30-goal scorer, has game-breaking speed, had huge playoff moments, and is a perfect complement to Montreal's grinding defensive identity. His style was ahead of his time and overshadowed by the 1993 Cup narratives, Waugh, Desjardins, and Leclerc. Courtnall is the lost speedster, a modern player trapped in a pre-modern NHL. Russ Courtnall was traded for Shayne Corson. This trade reframed both players' legacies. Petr Svoboda is one of the most underrated defensemen the Canadiens have ever developed. A smooth, mobile, puck-moving left-shot defenseman would be perfect in today's NHL. Svoboda was an elite skater, a transitional puck mover, and played big minutes in the 1986 Cup run. He was reliable, intelligent, and quietly excellent. Because he played in between Robinson and Chelios, he wasn't flashy nor was he physical and was not a point producer. Plus, Montreal did not yet value the modern defenseman archetype. Svoboda is the prototype of the overlooked puck mover, a player 20 years ahead of his time. Jeff Hackett was one of the most quietly brilliant goaltenders Montreal has had since Patrick Waugh, and also one of the most forgotten. Hackett consistently had excellent numbers, stole games nightly, and stabilized a franchise with no identity. He was also one of the best technically sound goaltenders of the late 90s. He is often forgotten because he played behind weak rosters, had no playoff runs to cement his legacy, and was overshadowed by Jose Theodore's rise. Montreal only mythologizes goalies who win cups, and Hackett is the lost elite goalie, a star whose environment erased his impact. These four players, Corson, Courtnall, Svoboda, and Hackett, form a perfect microcosm of Montreal's forgotten excellence. Corson, the emotional anchor who played in the wrong era, Courtnall, the speedster whose style was too modern for his time, Svoboda, the puck-moving defenseman who arrived before the league valued his archetype, and Hackett, the elite goalie trapped behind flawed teams. Together, they represent the lost backbone of the Habs post-dynasty identity, players who were essential, impactful, and legitimately excellent, but overshadowed by timing, narrative, and the gravitational pull of Montreal's mythic eras. Damphousse, Chelios, Richer, and Naslund are treated as footnotes in a franchise that only mythologizes dynasties and miracles. They are the forgotten core, the players who carried Montreal through its most turbulent decades. They are the players who produced at elite levels, who won cups, who earned awards, and who never received the myth-making treatment that the franchise chooses to give to its chosen legends. Put these four together, you get a shadow dynasty, a group of players who were individually elite but collectively overshadowed by the eras around them.